Welcome to Our Great Experiment. I'm Daniel Agamo. We live in a political moment that is marked by vitriol and polarization. Yet we also live in an era that is marked by grassroots mobilization and political populism. Have we been here before? To try to analyze the similarities between past and present, I sat down for conversation with Nick Pixler, a student of history. Nick works at the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center in North Dakota, researching subjects in Native American history surrounding the region and the North American fur trading system. He graduated from Black Hills State University with history degrees and political science degrees. He's active in political organization on and off campus throughout the Dakotas, as well as organized rallies and protests in recent years for subjects from gun rights, the legalization of cannabis, women's rights, and environmental protections. I hope you find this conversation enlightening. Our email is ourgreatexperiment2025@gmail.com. Nick Pixler, how you doing?
I'm good, sir. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. I'm really happy to be here today talking with you. Thank you for agreeing to come on.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity.
Now, you and I, we go back a couple of years. We went to the same undergrad university. We've been in a classroom with spirited debate, and so I've seen you interact with people who disagree with you, and so when you reached out to me about coming on, I was very excited because I know the kind of person you are. You are someone who has spirited beliefs and intelligent beliefs, but you're also willing to reach across the aisle and talk to people who might not share those beliefs. So I look forward to this.
Me as well. Thank you.
So, just as kind of an introduction, there's going to be people watching this who don't know you. Could you share a little bit about just your general background? In terms of politics, what issues do you care about? Like, what really gets you engaged?
Yeah, growing up in North Dakota, it's kind of been a huge epicenter since the early 1900s for, very populist movements. And I think me and you have actually talked about that before. I'm a very grassroots type of person. I really love those upbringings. I'm more kind of focused on state and local issues
Mm.
because that's really what helps your community on a day-to-day basis. I come from a pretty liberal household. Yet again, being growing up in North Dakota, I do have some great inspirations and good leadership in this state that has kind of motivated me on a more conservative side. So I do have some really great kind of inspirations on both ends. I've helped with different things when it comes to individual freedoms, gun rights, the legalization of different aspects in our country, different stuff like that. And, I really like to kind of expand on both areas, whether it's left leaning or right leaning. I'm one of those believers that you can always find a middle to those subjects.
That's awesome. And I know you're a student of history. You studied both political science and history, but I'm particularly interested in the work you're currently doing. You're working at the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. Uh, what kind of work do you do?
Yeah, so I'm kind of a jack of all trades over there. Currently, right now, I just got done with a research program based on edible plants of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I'm doing a lot of research over on the North American fur trading. I actually, this previous month, just gave a presentation at a state park based on the North American fur trading system and its significance to the Native Americans here in the area. I also do a little bit of gallery management, a little bit of administration work too, with the help of my colleagues and higher ups as well. So, like I said, I'm really just around the old place. I like to experience a lot of different aspects of it.
That's awesome. It's cool to, you know, be talking to someone who went to university, studied, and is now applying that degree to something in the real world. That's really cool. But I guess to begin our conversation, I want to think big picture, right? We're both young, right? We've both been raised in a political environment that's, in the landscape of social media, right? We haven't known a world of American politics that isn't um, perpetuated by divisiveness, polarization, and that's only amplified by social media. So, as a broad question, when you think about the future, whether it's of your local community in North Dakota, the United States, or just the international community, are you optimistic? And if not, like what gives you pause? What concerns you the most?
Well, I would say that I am rather optimistic in all honesty. One of the things that I just read this past, I'd say maybe in the span of a year and a half, is how our generation, the younger generations, we really do see social media a lot differently than the older generations do. And I think that is going to help us with how we control and mitigate a lot of this fear mongering that's going on in the country right now. A lot of us in this younger generation of Gen Z and younger, we use social media often as kind of a way to express how we're feeling, almost like a decompression aspect. A lot of us don't necessarily take social media as seriously as other older generations do. And I think that's really going to affect how um, social media plays into the daily lifestyles and choices of our country. I also am seeing a huge wave of younger generations getting politically active and not just, the loudest voice being heard or anything in that matter, but rather, actually educating themselves on what they personally believe rather than instead of, what their parents have said, what, large corporations or large media sources have said for them to understand as well. That's kind of a little optimistic for me. The biggest thing as well that I've been seeing, especially here in my state, is a lot of older generations finally kind of stepping down from being career politicians. I believe it was today or yesterday, I was reading on NPR that a lot of these senators and legislators from both aisles of the political spectrum are deciding to step down because they just feel like they're getting old. They want a lot of younger generations to finally start getting active in politics. And I think that's going to be really optimistic. Um, when it comes to a little bit of hesitation, though, uh, you know, the hard part about history is Mark Twain said it best. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And in such a large kind of political state that we're in right now, it's a little nervous to see where we're going to go because there's different things that rhyme with a lot of different periods in history. But with us being a whole new generation and having whole new abilities in what we're at right now, it could go any direction. And I mean, it's a little anxious, as a historian, you don't know where it's going to go. You
Mhm.
can see the different outlets of where and what's going to happen and how this could lead to one thing or another, but you don't necessarily know just yet. You have to play it ear by ear.
Yeah, that's you touched upon a lot of fascinating subjects, and I admire your optimism. Right, as young people, I think it's important that we stay engaged and we stay at least remotely optimistic, if not about the future, at least about the present, about what we can do in the moment to treat each other with respect, to have that engaging dialogue, and talking about you mentioned one of the benefits of living in a social media age is you get exposed to more ideas, I think, than like traditional mainstream news, whether it's,
Hmm.
cable, print, whatever, right? But then also, I do think it's going to be, especially in the tumultuous times we live in, with the rise or the apparent rise of political violence, it's going to be very important that young people don't shy away from engaging. It's very important that young people don't shy away from talking politics because it's frowned upon, right? We need to talk politics, but we need to learn to do it in the correct way. And you talked about, subscribing to ideas of populism, local engagement, community activism, small d democracy, right? Engagement. Um, when you think about the health of democracy right now, you know, whether it's, North Dakota itself or the United States broadly, is our democracy healthy? It's a big question.
That's a huge question. Personally, I would say there are definitely aspects that we can notice what's going on right now that can significantly deteriorate it. However, I don't think we're at the point where it cannot be fixed or turned around. I do think that we are at one of those key moments right now where we do need to watch out with how it turns. Just because, like you said, there is a lot of political violence right now, and this does come from an accumulation of almost I'd say maybe 20 years of nothing really happening. And I feel like there hasn't been a lot done democratically, and that's making people turn to a lot more extremes. But one of our teachers, Mr. Van B, said it perfectly. The whole point of democracy is to compromise. That's the whole point, is to get together and actually talk about it and make sure that we can find a fine line where everyone agrees. We might not agree fully, and that's okay. But in order for everyone to be happy, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. And I think that's what a lot of people need to remember, especially on both sides, is that as much as you don't agree with the American right next to you on everything, you can agree on some things. And I think it's important to find those things that you agree about.
Could not have said it better, right? Politics is not a zero sum game. You're never going to get everything you want. Uh, and I wish it was easier for people to understand that. But I enjoy talking to students of history, right? I am not a student of history. As much as history is fascinating to me, I do not have the skill sets of a historian, right? That's far above my expertise. And I had the privilege of talking to another historian, AJ Schumann, and he was talking about what we perceive as the rise in political violence currently in the country is nothing new, right? The United States has always been relatively violent, right? 1 in 10 presidents have been the subject of lethal assassinations. 1 in 5 have been the subject of assassination attempts. And so I'm curious, as a student of history, you might take a diverging opinion, but do you think the current moment we're living in is different from past moments of deep polarization? I think of, the wartime America, right, in the middle of the 19th century, the Civil War era. I think of the 1960s as being a deeply polarized time. What's your read on this?
Honestly, I really do agree with him. Political violence has been a very normal thing for the United States. If you want to go all the way back, I mean, look at Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. I mean, that's some could consider that political violence, going into the caning of Charles Sumner. I mean, you had people fighting, pulling knives and guns on each other in the middle of Congress.
Hmm.
Um, you know, One thing that was really crazy to me is watching what was going on in these past recent days. I told a close friend of mine, I said, this is really reminding me of the late 1960s. I
Mm.
said, this is really, really kind of just hitting that part of the brain where it's like, well, I've seen this before. I've definitely seen this before. And, the same day that I said that, I was watching that interview with the Utah governor, and he said that this does remind him of the late 1960s as well. And so just those things, I don't think that this is anything new that we've seen. But when these moments do happen in our country, they happen at very serious moments. And it's something that a lot of people need to look out for, because it can turn into larger, broader contexts. And a lot of bigger events can happen from something like this. I think our leaders right now need to analyze what is going on and to take the right and respectful step to make sure that something like I don't want to say the Civil War, but a conflict that, or something that breaks out in that manner, doesn't happen.
Yeah, brilliantly put, because unfortunately, there are elected officials really on both sides who make inflammatory remarks about, I remember reading a tweet from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about it's time for a national divorce, right? It's time for a national separation. And, the simple rebuttal to that is, well, we're not divided along geographic lines like we were during the Civil War, right? We live amongst each other, both blue and red. We're neighbors, we're coworkers, we're colleagues. But that's not to say that deep polarization can't cause instances that we've seen in the country over the past, really decade, right? Normalized everyday occurrences of political violence that is something we want to avoid. Now, I'm curious. Something that is a really fascinating topic to me is revisionist history, and I think both political spectrums are guilty of this, right? Both sides of our political spectrum are guilty of this, and it's been in the debate, right, for ages, right? I go back to the 2010s debate over historical statues. It was a huge debate that permeated our culture, and to some extent, it still does. Of course, this idea of the United States being the greatest country in the world, right? Rhetoric like that, some agree, some disagree, but they use history as a way to define their agreement or disagreement, right? Whether past injustices or past heroic successes make the United States what it is. I'm curious, as someone who studies history, how do you approach that tension when you see politicians use history incorrectly or correctly to justify their current ends, right? To restore past heroic moments.
Yeah. If a politician is actually knowing what they're talking about when it comes to a historical scenario or historical context due to a subject, I think it's pretty clever. Being a little history nerd, when they do point out something that is accurate, I do have to kind of give a little golf clap because it is impressive to know that there are people up in our government who actually do still pay attention to subjects like this. Um, it's actually I'm having a debate right now with a lot of my colleagues on whether or not the postmodernist perspective of history is slowly dying. And that does have to kind of really coincide with the revisionist history movement that was happening in the mid to late 2010s. Personally, I think that the postmodernist approach and revisionist history, I think it's going in a different direction now, and I think it's because it has allowed a lot of different topics and conversation to occur, but now it's kind of just a revolving door. It's going right where it started, and I think that you know I think it's clever what politicians can do with that subject, but I also do think that we need to acknowledge what had happened. Going back to what you pointed out with the statues, as much as these people that these statues were created out of did do awful things and fully acknowledge those awful things, for me and you to sit here and discuss these subjects, those did have to happen. As I'm not saying that it was anything good. I don't agree with what had happened, but I do acknowledge the fact that you do it did have to happen in order for us to get here where we are. So that's kind of how I feel about that subject.
Yeah, you referenced a Mark Twain quote earlier, right, about history rhyming. And you know, when I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about for this interview, knowing that, the work you do in the field of history, thinking about whether, historical sites, museums still matter, but just broadly, does history matter? Does it inform how we currently think of subjects, or should we forget past experiences and try to embark on a new path? Although that's probably not possible, right? There's no new thing on the earth under the rock. But does history still matter in the United States in 2025?
I've been having that question asked a lot to me recently, and what I tell people is history does matter, but it also needs to be taken in a grain of salt because you can't apply things. I hear a lot of people say that, oh, this reminds me of um, you hear this very often is, this is starting to remind me of the political state of Nazi Germany. And it's like, I understand what you're saying when you say that, but you also have to understand it is nothing like that. We are not coming out of a horrible economic depression. We had not just gotten out of a world conflict. There is nothing that is fervently saying that there is a mission or a goal from one political side or the other. I really don't think that political violence in America is anywhere close to that. If you look at that moment, you do have partisan groups of communists who are arming themselves and, taking over whole cities in Germany at that time. That is not happening in this country. As much as political discourse is at its peak right now, it is nothing compared to what was going on in those moments. You don't have something like bleeding Kansas going on where American citizens are killing each other over just a singular state or a singular view like that. I also think that social media and our technologies, I mean, they're supposed to allow us to easily communicate and make sure that nothing like those moments happen anymore. And if it wasn't for your ability to be able to express how you feel on a readily available moment, um, I, I, I think it would be a lot worse than what it actually is today.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious as someone who you interact with the public, right? I've done my fair share of time, working in tourism when you have to explain historical events. It's interesting. You notice how people engage in history, especially as it relates to, sensitive history that affects different social groups. You notice people engage with it differently depending on their ideology. And while you might not know their ideology, sometimes you can infer it based on how they interact with that history. I'm curious if you've had any similar experiences.
Oh, 100%. Especially with working with, my location, we are on the National Historic Trail of Lewis and Clark. So we do get a lot of people from around the country, and not even just around the country, but also from around the world.
Mhm.
I've met people from Eastern Europe. I've met people from Australia visiting this location just for its significance. And, one of the things that you have to understand is you have to acknowledge both perspectives. For example, over at the Lewis and Clark Center, we do talk about York. York was William Clark's enslaved gentleman that he brought along with him on the expedition. As much as he was treated like an equal, you also do have to acknowledge the fact of the time period. York, for example, when they came back from the expedition, had so much freedoms that he thought that he was going to get his freedom. They came back and I mean, he didn't really get his freedom until at least 5 years after the expedition had occurred. So you do have to kind of make sure that both sides are validated. Yes, you are acknowledging and talking about a significant person like that on the expedition and their role to it, but you also do have to understand and acknowledge the realities of that time period as well. So I think it's just kind of one of those balancing things. You have to find that moment where both scales are even.
Yeah, well, that's a tricky thing to do. So I applaud you for making that attempt and the work that those of you who work in history or history related fields is very important. And so I commend you for that. Now, this is a fun question, but is there a historical hero of yours or a figure that you think serves as an example, someone that we can look to learn from in times like these, where we're so politically polarized, we view our opposition as enemies to be taken out, to be destroyed, not as the loyal opposition? Who do you look to for guidance?
This might sound cheesy being from where I am, but it is definitely Theodore Roosevelt. That gentleman knew how to touch the hearts of everyone on both ends of the spectrum, whether it was continuing the authority and dominance of the United States in their hemisphere when it came to Cuba and Central America. Speak softly and carry a large stick. He's talking about the dominance of the United States. But then again, if you also look from another perspective, he's one of the first earliest conservationists of our country. He's also very adamant about workers' rights and workers' protections. He's also kind of the first trust buster. He's fighting against, corporations and a lot of these large companies kind of manipulating and taking advantage of the small time worker. And, he's understanding that, hey, me and you as an average citizen, we're going to have a lot more in common with each other than what me or you have in common with a corporation. And he was trying to acknowledge that for the rest of the country as well. And I think that's one of the big reasons why he was so controversial in his time period is because, a lot of people said that he was a socialist, but, you know, he really wasn't. He really was just kind of the tried and true American. I mean, he was called the first cowboy president. And it's because, he he did his time, He came out here, he owned a ranch, he worked and got his hands dirty, and he came back and still wanted to do what he did.
I'm curious, thinking about that period in history, right? The late 19th century, early 20th century, a time of mass influence from large corporations, uh, terribly bad working conditions where people struggled to make it by, fervor movements of populism. It sounds an awful lot like what we're going through today, right? Large corporations, especially, tech currently, have large influence over the federal government and policies that come out of Congress and the executive branch. Working class folks continue to struggle to make ends meet, but also struggle to get involved in the political process, which over the past decade We've seen the rise of populism on both the left and the right via populist movements, via Bernie Sanders, via Donald Trump. I'm curious if you see this reflection at all at the beginning of the well, I guess we're approaching midway through the 21st century.
Yeah, no, I really do see it, and that's kind of why I say that Teddy Roosevelt is that representative, is because there's a lot of things that look very similar. Going back to the quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And we are seeing a lot of those same tendencies happen during this time period, almost 100 years after this had occurred. And I think something that we should probably take with a grain of salt as well. Looking at how politicians and leaders of our country at that time period have reacted to those changes, because just like now, they were rapid changes. Um, the only difference is, a lot of these politicians and a lot of these corporations, they were using racial influences to divide people, especially workers during this time period, because they knew how powerful workers congregating together could actually be. And now today, instead of using a racial thing, I mean, some could argue it's still a racial thing, but you're looking at more of a left and right opportunity. And instead of trying to get them together as average Joes, you're seeing someone or something still trying to divide those populations, because they know that populism is a powerful and effective mechanism to democracy. um, it always has been, it always will be, and that's why a lot of people who are on the populist movement have a lot of power as well. It's because power is in numbers. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, he did win the 2024 election again, and you can see the election results. A lot of different areas who were usually blue came out for red,
Mhm.
and it's the reason why.
And that's what's so striking about the moment we're living in. And, as someone who studies American politics, but more specifically American political behavior, we're witnessing a change in the makeup of both parties, right? It used to be, if you go back 2 decades, you don't even have to go back 2 decades, but it used to be that the Republican Party in the modern age was the party of the affluent, the party of the well educated. But we're starting to see shifts in that. And it's really fascinating to see cleavages in where working class Americans, who make up a vast majority of the country, are migrating to politically. But one question that I ask every single guest that comes on, because I think it's the most important question I could ask, is I know you. I know that you engage in respectful discourse. So for those listening to this who maybe find it really detestable, right? They talk to people online or in person who they think is just morally corrupt. They say the worst things in the world. What would you challenge them? How would you challenge them to engage more authentically and respectfully when it comes to having these difficult but necessary conversations?
I think one thing for everyone to remember, especially in a time like this, is as much as you do not agree with a respectable person, you do have to remember that you are both looking to fix a problem inside of your country. The fact that you both acknowledge this issue or this problem in the country is where you should be looking at. You shouldn't be looking at how to solve it and while your solutions are different from each other, because that's the whole point of discourse, is that everyone's supposed to have a different opinion, but you're supposed to be able to solve this problem together rather than just fighting and bickering and finger pointing and all of that. I tell people all the time, you don't have to agree with my views, but you should probably understand and you should definitely appreciate that someone is trying to find a solution to the same problem that you acknowledge, just through a different perspective. And
Mhm.
I am completely open with a lot of people to talk and understand with them about how we solve these different issues. You'd be surprised. Once you start finding a solution, I joke about this all the time. There's a lot of right wing conservative people here, but once you start talking about these very liberal views in a way to fix a problem that you both acknowledge, you'd be surprised how many times they agree with you in different views.
Yeah. I have had kind of a similar experience talking to, I've had friends that are Bernie Sanders supporters. I've had friends that are Donald Trump supporters. And the funniest conversation you can have with these folks is when you tell them, you have a lot more in common than you realize, right? you obviously disagree on a lot of social issues, sure, but when you get down to the bread and butter issues of, economic policy, labor policy, there are areas of overlap there. And I think as citizens of this country, it's when we realize that it's that all of a sudden our voices become more powerful and influential because we're working towards the same goal instead of, pulling a rope from two different ends. We're pulling together. The last question that I want to get your thoughts on is more for the audience. If you could leave them with one thought, can be one word or just one thought about where you think we're headed. Where do you think that is?
I'm pretty I'm pretty optimistic. I'm gonna say that we are going into the direction of unity. And I think those voices are that are being really loud right now and kind of dissenting, telling people that, the people that say that, Charlie Kirk deserved what had happened to him, I think those people are going to soon realize that they are in the minority. And a lot of the people who are focused on, ensuring that their communities on both ends are protected and well preserved are going to understand that they're going to start being filtered out. And I think people are going to start to realize that violence is not the answer. And social cues and social pressures are one of the biggest influences for people. And just make sure that you're listening, you know? I'm not a Christian person, but, I have been going to vigils at churches the last couple of days. Like I said, I am not religious in any way, but I'm willing to go to those boundaries to talk with people and to make sure that they know as much as we don't agree on things, we can agree on one thing.
Mhm.
Our future needs to be well preserved.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. As always, if you're listening to this and you find yourself terribly disagreeing with something said, remember to always give the presumption of grace. Remember that people on the political opposition are not coming from the worst of intentions. Instead, they're coming from a human intention, and everyone um, has opinions that arrive naturally through their upbringing, through their social interaction, their socialization. So always give political opposition the presumption of grace. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, man. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, great conversation.